the whole calories in, calories out thing. It's good, but it leaves way too much out. Let's dive in it. So, topic is navigating the thin line, bodybuilding or dieting, and the risks of ED. Can't really say the whole word, but basically those who are, starting that journey out, whether you're, your journey to the stage or journey to a certain look, you're trying to get into a wedding dress, or you want to go back to, you want to lose a bunch of weight or get to how you used to be when you felt like when you were younger, whatever it is. There's a journey that happens. And here, I want to get your perspective on some strategies to, ensuring that we can avoid that slippery slope. Like, one in every five people end up having a ED. So, very prevalent in this industry. So, number one, I'm looking at one of those ways, balanced approach to nutrition. What is your take on, how can we use that to our advantage and to avoid, going on the slippery slope of an off balance of nutrition and, and self?
I think it really has to start with macromolecules. So, I mean, you're familiar too with how this works. We divvy up the calories, and there is a minimum threshold for our fats, for instance. I mean, yes, for women, but for men too. And I mean, like for me, I typically don't like to go under 40 grams of fat per day. Now, do I? Yes, there are individual cases where there's a good rationale, but to what degree am I going under that? I mean, I just had a girl who competed in wellness at very competitive show, and for her we took her down to 30 grams. I mean, so even though that's below that threshold, it was still one of those things. I was like, well, we're going to sacrifice a little bit here, but it's still not to the extent that you see some coaches take their athletes to. I mean, like I myself, like I've had coaches take me down to no grams of fat. So, I mean, the idea was like, I mean, and we both know like, hey, are you still getting fat, trace fats, from other animal proteins? Yes, you absolutely are. But really, when you dive into the extent at which that's damaging and it's no longer productive, I mean, I think especially for the female athlete, we got to be careful with it. But just globally, I would say the elimination of any macromolecule, and we're really just talking about fats and carbs, I think you got to be careful because, like, when you start pulling carbs, then you run into issues just with performance. And I mean, I don't see it very often that a coach goes crazy low on protein. I maybe some do, but what we typically see in our space is the reduction of fats and carbs, and unfortunately, sometimes coaches are taking both of those down to virtually nothing. So you have this athlete who's just running on protein, and it's like their training performance is going to be downregulated hormonally. I mean, they already were going to be downregulated, but now that's exacerbated. So I think having a good framework around understanding, okay, what is the minimum we can have these specific macromolecules at? And I mean, what about for you? Like for carbs, like do you have a threshold that you're like, hey, like past this point, I don't think it's productive?
Well, I was literally going to ask you, what does, like, when you were saying, like, in terms of grams, just so people can understand, what would be, I have my answer, but what would be like, what would that look like in terms of percentages of fat from from your total caloric intake? What does that look like in terms of calories, like, percentage wise?
I mean, gosh, it's been a while since I've used percentages.
Yes.
I would say like 20%. Is that
Yeah, yeah,
generally?
exactly. I was gonna literally say between like 20-30%. So for me, when it comes to, dieting somebody down, the protein is always going to be at least body weight, per gram. And as it goes down, I will increase that as well. Depending, a natural or non-athlete, a natural athlete. For me, that's my target for going into this show, into Mass Olympia, anabolic free. I know that that's going to be something I need to make sure that stays pretty fairly high. And then my fats never, or even who I coach, they don't go anything lower than 20%, like no matter what. And then I fill the rest of my calories with carbs. So whatever else is left, no carbs will get that, will get the rest of the calories. And then as we go down, like it might be, body weight per calories, and I mean body weight per grams and protein, 20 to 30%, maybe starting at 30% of fat, and then fill the rest with carbs. And then as we go, I'll decrease carbs before I will protein fats. And then when it gets to the ultra low, it'll be like, to the point where you're about, maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks out, whatever. Protein is fairly high. Fats will not be lower than 20. If we can get away with it, if it need be, then yeah, but that's like, I'll say those are special cases. And the rest, like, it'll be riding on very low, I would say, like, carbs in terms of, like, grains. Like, so the other ones, they'll be higher in fiber at the end. So I would say, like, protein, fats, and then, like, at the end of prep, it'll be like more fiber, keep your digest a little high, more satiated, and obviously, like, avoiding a lot more water retention at the very end of prep. That's kind of how I look at I would say, structuring a diet to make sure that we're, in a place of, where macronutrients are available to help with everything we need in terms of being optimal in that journey. If it makes sense, right?
Right, right. And
Yeah.
I think you hit something really important for listeners to catch on to, so I hope they did, is that you're not starting your prep off hyper aggressive. You're not just going in and like, okay, we're going to 20 grams of fat. We're not switching all of the carb sources to our, very fibrous vegetables. I mean, you're trying to preserve that for as long as possible. And then there's rationale to make those changes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So basically what is, I guess, like, the opposite of that would be like, what happens, because, what are the repercussions of doing the opposite? What have you seen? Because that's like, obviously, like, having balanced approach, and what you said is like bang on. Like, if you want to have like an optimal, like, the whole calories in, calories out thing, CCO, whatever, it's good, but it leaves way too much out. And I find that I get a lot of, new athletes slash clients that come from a place of, I only eat protein and carbs. And then once I'm all the way down, I've basically cut out all the calories I have. You're in a place of a rebound that's just going to be, hard on your body. Can you explain that process in terms of, like, what, like, of why the body all of a sudden, spikes back up after, say, avoiding or doing the opposite of what we just talked about?
Well, there's certainly a shift in how your body really utilizes those calories for energy. And I would actually say that this isn't one of those things that's specific necessarily to post show. It really comes down to that metabolic flexibility, which admittedly, like, I am not very metabolically flexible, whether that be physiologically or psychologically. I don't like going from using my fats as my fuel source versus my carbs. And I guess I should explain that in a very pedestrian way, because I think listeners, like, they want to know why. Hey, why did some coaches diet you on just fats, or why did some coaches like completely eliminate fats? And I think when it comes down to it, is there are individuals who do perform better, and they enjoy being on a certain macromolecule as opposed to carbs. Let's say that individual likes fats, but when it comes to the repercussions of making that switch, I mean, there's the mental aspect. If that person is really sensitive to that switch, that can be hindering. But then physiologically, I mean, I would say I see this more so with the switch from using protein as your fuel source versus carbs, because protein, you actually have to go through a more extensive process in terms of converting that to a usable fuel source. So, I mean, not that anyone asked, but it's called gluconeogenesis. It's less efficient. That's really what listeners need to take away from that, is carbs are going to be your most efficient form of energy. So when you're leveraging other macromolecules as your energy source, I mean, it's going to take longer and it's not going to be as readily available. So what you might find is that your training performance does suffer. And I guess I'm speaking more while you're in that process. So depending on where you're switching from, if you're going from fats or I guess a large amount of proteins as your fuel source and you're switching to carbs, you could actually see a positive benefit from a training performance standpoint. But to something that you brought up is like, okay, well, it can look different aesthetically when you make that switch. Well, yeah, so you, gosh, I may mess this up, but I believe it's like for every 1 gram of carb you store, you pull into, you pull 3 grams of water.
Two to three,
So
yeah, 2 to 3 grams of
two
water.
to three.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Coming in clutch.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, so aesthetically, if you're not used to that, that can be a little off-putting, especially for female clients. I mean, I myself, like I struggled with that, with increasing my carbs and mentally being okay with seeing that shift in scale weight. Typically, I see the scale weight is more problematic than even the compositional changes, which I
Yeah.
think as a coach, you have to be able to coach. I mean, like down to the definition and be like, hey, this is actually going to help you lift more in the gym. Like you're actually going to perform better. So even though it might be off-putting and you're not used to seeing that increase in scale weight, you have to know that like in the long run, this is going to benefit you more than your current plan, more than what you were doing before.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of people they'll say, "Oh, I was on a keto diet and I lost so much weight." And then when I got off, I'm carb sensitive. It's like, well, no, you eliminated carb source. And then when you started eating carbs, for to make it easy to understand, if you add 100 grams of carbs, you just added 200 to 300 grams of water that are going to make physiological changes on your body that are going to make, changes on the scale. So when you start seeing the scale go up and then you're not as tight as you looked before because of more, subcutaneous water retention, that plays with your mind. And then you're in this like, what do I do? Do I go back and do I do no carbs? And you're back, I can't do no carbs because I like carbs. And when you're out eating carbs, you're more sensitive to carbs because you haven't eaten them in a while. You're not carb sensitive. You're just, your body is lacking that macronutrient, the macromolecule, and wants more of it because it needs it in a sense. So yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely
And
agree. Go ahead.
and I was gonna say too, what I tend to see is actually an improvement in digestion when people switch from these ultra high protein intakes to a carb intake. Just from a percentage standpoint, I mean, like there are times I've seen 60% protein for that client's calories, and when they make that switch, I mean, a big positive shift they also see in addition to performance is digestion, because I mean they're not having that slow digestion from such a high protein intake, which
Yeah.
especially for petite athletes, for women who are just sitting at that 100, 105, 110, having them at 200 grams of protein, I mean like in my experience, maybe it's been the same for you, I mean like a lot of those women, they tend to have more problems that can sometimes like send them down a rabbit hole of thinking they now have a GI issue, or that
Yeah.
they're having permeability issues in the gut lining, and it's like it might be as simple as you're just overdoing the protein.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. They like just understanding that we need all of it. A good balance is going to help avoid some of those, slippery slopes of being mentally, you know, unpleasant or just, I would say upset about the results you're seeing and then blame it on whatever your nutrition is or whatever the problem is. And then we have this like back and forth yo-yo of, I don't know, craziness. Yeah.